It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
You're listening to Killer Communications, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Campus Killings, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
A special note about the show before we get started with this episode. Growing and improving as an indie podcast can't be done without taking note of and acting on listeners' feedback and suggestions. To this point in Season 1, we've had a lot of great feedback and praise from our listeners. While we appreciate that, it's only fair to say, too, that we've had a lot of feedback and suggestions saying that the sound effects we've used in the show are a distraction and can be jarring, especially to listeners using headphones. Multiple people have said the same thing, that the show and the material is great, and there's no need for sound effects. So to that end, we're going to adjust our format for the show moving forward and eliminate any sound effects from future episodes. In addition, we'll try to go back to old episodes and remove sound effects from those too as time permits. While this change alters some of the uniqueness of our show, we feel that making these subtle changes will ensure a more pleasurable listening experience for the majority of our listeners and help the show to grow. If the show doesn't grow, then we won't have a show for very long. For those of our listeners who like the show as is, sound effects and all, we hope you'll still be a fan of the episodes and appreciate the material we are presenting. Thanks to everyone that's taken the time to listen to Season 1, and we hope you continue to listen to the remainder of this season and beyond. Thank you. Introduction. The late 1970s in Wichita, Kansas was a terrifying time for many women, as the serial killer BTK was using Wichita as his hunting grounds. So when middle-aged telephone company secretary Ruth Finley received a strange phone call on a night when she was alone in her home, police were convinced she would become BTK's next victim. Chapter 1. The Phone Call. On a summer night in 1977, Ruth Finley was anxiously sitting in her dark home alone after leaving her husband, Ed, at the hospital. He had a medical episode working in their yard that afternoon, and although he'd been stable when Ruth left him that evening, she was still worried about his condition. The Finleys had been married for many years, with 2 grown sons living on their own, and Ed's hospital stay was the first time in decades that Ruth was at home by herself. So the sound of the phone ringing at such a late hour was incredibly startling. Ruth picked up, expecting a concerned family member or friend inquiring about Ed's condition. But the voice on the other end was no one she knew. The man asked to speak to Ruth Smock, her maiden name, and one she hadn't used in close to 25 years. But she answered that yes, she was Ruth Smock, wondering what this man could want. The stranger began to read a newspaper article to her, one that she knew all too well. In 1946, when Ruth was only 16 years old, she'd been grabbed from behind in her childhood kitchen by an unknown assailant. While she'd used her thumbs to poke the intruder's eyes and try to get away, a chloroform rag was shoved over her nose. The only thing she remembered from the attack was a fuzzy recollection of a man heating up a flat iron on the stove, and then when she woke up, to find horrific burns on the inside of both thighs. The story had been published in the Fort Scott Tribune the day after she'd gone to the police about the incident, but her name had not been released to the public, and her attacker had never been found. While Ruth vividly remembered the incident, no one outside of her family could have known she was the 16-year-old teenager in the article. She'd never even told her husband about it. How did this stranger know? And why was he calling? But that soon became clear, as he demanded Ruth pay him money, or he would spread her awful secret around town. Ruth hung up on the man, hoping it was just a terrible prank call, and maybe someone from her hometown had simply made some cunning connections. But unfortunately for Ruth, this phone call would be the beginning of a nightmare. Chapter 2. Mysterious Mail. Ed came home a few days later from the hospital, but Ruth didn't bother to tell him about the terrifying phone call she'd received. She hadn't gotten another one since the first night, and was hoping it had just been some young people doing a prank. But a few weeks later, she received an envelope at work, addressed to her and not the company. Inside was the Fort Scott Tribune article about her assault, and the clipping was an original from 1946. No explanation accompanied the clipping, and Ruth didn't recognize the handwriting on the envelope. Why was she being taunted with this? She threw the article and the envelope away, hoping again that someone was playing a sick joke on her, and if she ignored it, they would lose interest. But the opposite happened. Following the strange envelope, Ruth began receiving multiple phone calls a week from the male extortioner, though he would only talk if Ruth picked up the phone. Anytime Ed answered, the call dropped. Ruth still hadn't told Ed about the extortionist or the strange envelope she'd received at work. She and Ed had grown up in large farming families where things were simple and straightforward, and a modest, untroubled life was the goal. To admit that she was having such trouble, even to her husband, was something Ruth hadn't been brought up to do, so she suffered silently, hoping and praying that the man on the phone would just go away. But as summer turned to early fall, Ruth would be forced to admit that she had a tormentor. Chapter 3. A Stalker. While out shopping one day, Ruth was approached by a nondescript man in his 40s. He tried to talk to her, but she'd later claimed that something about him terrified her and she ignored him. She was unsure if the voice of this man was the same as the person trying to extort her on the phone, but she got away from him all the same. Not long after, on another shopping trip, she was approached again by a nondescript man in his 40s. Only this time, when she refused to engage with him, she claimed he grabbed her arm, and as she looked in his face, she could have sworn it was the same man who tried to talk to her before. Along with these terrifying encounters, Ruth was also still receiving the extortion phone calls several times a week, and clearly the man was escalating. Ruth began to fear for her safety and had no choice but to finally admit to Ed that someone was trying to hurt her. Once he knew what his wife had been suffering through, Ed brought Ruth to the police station to file a report about the harassment. But this only seemed to increase the stalker's behavior. Not only did the calls intensify, but Ruth began receiving many strange envelopes, this time sent to her home address. Most were postcards containing messily handwritten poems of a dark nature. One stated, "Here's to you, my tender Valentine, red with blood and tied with twine, nothing too much for a Valentine, gone from here by a whim of mine." Others contained threats that if she didn't pay the man on the phone, bad things would happen. And though the Finleys brought all this evidence to the police, nothing seemed to slow their arrival. But one investigator, Lieutenant Bernie Drowatsky, took a particular interest in Ruth's case. He'd been investigating a serial killer that had been using Kansas as his hunting ground, BTK.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Chapter 4. The Victim of a Serial Killer? An acronym for Bind, Torture, Kill, which is how he dispatched his victims, BTK frequently sent letters and postcards to police and the local news outlets, taunting them about their inability to catch him. In one case, he'd even written to one of his victims. Was it possible that Ruth was a new intended target? As interesting as it seemed, the nature of her stalker didn't fit with the rest of BTK's usual patterns. Likewise, the letters in Ruth's possession did not match the style or handwriting of those sent by BTK. But investigators concluded this could simply have been a change in the serial killer's tactics. Unfortunately for Ruth, there wasn't much law enforcement could do but continue building her case file and hoping for a break. But things took a violent turn in November 1978, only a few weeks after the Finleys had filed their first police report. Ruth was supposed to have been home around dinner time, but she never showed up. Ed reported her missing. And luckily, Ruth was found by police and brought to the station about 4 hours later. During questioning, she explained she used her lunch break to do some shopping in the downtown area, and that a man had jumped out of a blue Chevy when she was stopped at a crosswalk. He kicked her legs out from under her and then stuffed her into the backseat of a car. She noticed enough to see that another man was in the passenger seat, drinking beer from a brown paper bag. She claimed the two men took her purse, which contained a recent paycheck, and a key to her safety deposit box. However, Ruth also had a business card from the police department with Lieutenant Dratsky's information on it. According to Ruth, finding this card enraged the man with the beer, and he smashed Ruth in the head so hard she lost consciousness. When she woke up, the men were still driving her around, and she began hoping for some desperate way to escape. She came up with a plan and told the men she had to use the bathroom, at which point they drove her to a remote area and told her to get out and do her business. Once she was out of the car, Ruth ran for it, hiding in the underbrush until the car finally drove away. Once she was alone, she ran back into town and used the local business's phone to call 911. As BTK had killed another victim only a few weeks before, Wichita police were becoming increasingly convinced that Ruth had just been targeted by the serial killer, and the only way to make sure she was safe was to place her and Ed under 24-hour surveillance. Chapter 5. The Poet Emerges. Over the next 5 weeks, the Finleys had undercover police surrounding their home and workplaces to see if Ruth's attacker would try and come after her again. But much to the surprise of both Ruth and law enforcement, no one tried to physically bother the Finleys during this time. However, the level of disturbing letters and postcards Ruth received escalated. All the mail contained deranged, dark poetry in a messy handwriting. Ed began referring to the letter writer as the poet, and as the weeks passed, the poetry got more and more disturbing. But even with police watching the house, there was nothing anyone could do to stop the mail from coming, and the Finleys began to crack under the mental strain. Many nights, Ed sat up with a shotgun, wondering if the poet would get past the police protection and break into their home, while Ruth suffered from intense stomach issues and migraines from the stress. They couldn't leave their home except to go to work, and even then, they were trailed by plainclothes police. Ruth was afraid to leave the house for fear that the poet might get past law enforcement, and she would be abducted once again. And opening the mail was triggering, knowing that almost every day she would receive some kind of poem or a threatening letter. And to make matters even more complicated, the poet had begun sending similarly deranged letters to the Wichita police. But in the summer of 1979, almost as suddenly as they had appeared, the barrage of hate mail stopped, and the Finleys were able to resume a somewhat normal life. But just as Ruth was beginning to enjoy going out into the world again, her life took an unexpectedly violent turn. Chapter 6. Escalation. On the hot, humid day of August 31st, 1979, Ruth returned home from a shopping trip covered in blood and barely able to stand. Ed rushed her to the hospital where she was admitted for 3 stab wounds, 2 on her back and a near-fatal one to her side. The stabs were so deep, she spent the next 9 days in the hospital, while investigators came and went trying to find out who had done this to her. Ruth explained that she'd been accosted by a man in the parking lot as she was coming out of the store. He had grabbed her and tried to force her into his car, but she fought back, not knowing the man had a knife. She managed to get away and drive off, but wasn't able to give police any firm descriptions of what the man looked like. If this was BTK as law enforcement feared, then he dramatically changed his patterns. Normally, BTK was a night stalker, and had, at least up until that point, only accosted victims who were at home. He also never had stabbed them, preferring strangulation as his form of murder. But it didn't mean that he wasn't trying new things, as serial killers sometimes do. Police put Ruth under 24-hour surveillance at the hospital and continued providing around-the-clock protection after she returned home. But the poet seemed to know what had happened, and upon Ruth's release from the hospital, the barrage of threatening poetry returned. Between August 1979 and December 1980, Ruth received thousands of threats from the poet, demanding money and threatening her with harm if she didn't comply. And that wasn't all, as in January, Ruth also received a butcher knife wrapped in a red bandana that was shipped to her workplace in a cardboard box. Things were no better at home, as the poet began leaving disgusting gifts on the Finleys' doorstep, including a bottle of urine, a package filled with feces, and piles of trash in the mailbox. Their phone lines were also cut on Christmas Eve 1980, and the poet set their Christmas door wreath on fire and left an ice pick on the front porch. The Finleys were beside themselves at this point. They'd been under attack by whoever the poet was for over 3 years, and there didn't seem to be any way to find out who the perpetrator was. Police had interviewed over 300 people by December 1980, and had also sent the threatening letters from the poet to a psycholinguist for evaluation. And while the psycholinguist had concluded that whoever the writer was had psychotic tendencies, there was no direct correlation in them to the writings done by BTK. So if Ruth wasn't being harassed and targeted by Wichita's infamous serial killer, then who was the poet? No one knew, and the perpetrator's escalation was moving beyond the Finleys. In September 1981, the poet, who was still barraging Ruth with letters almost daily, branched out and sent a letter to Wichita Chief of Police Richard Lemunyon. In the letter, which outlined a plan to kill the chief's wife after the writer had murdered Ruth Finley, the writer also claimed to know the make and model of Chief Lemunyon's car, as well as his wife's route to work and their other family routines. With not only Ruth's life hanging in the balance, but now Chief Lemunyon's own family, he was determined to find out who the poet was.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Chapter 7. A Hidden Identity Revealed. Chief Lemunyon took all the evidence that had been collected over the past 3 years and laid it out on his desk, and he asked himself some important questions. What had been missed? Where were the possible connections that may have been overlooked? After a week of deeply investigating the evidence, Lemunyon noticed the following aspects. There were, interestingly, no witnesses to any of Ruth's abductions or attacks, even though all of them had happened in the daytime and in public parking lots or busy public streets. There had also been no physical evidence of an assailant in her abductions or attacks, aside from the stab wounds. No fingerprints, hairs, fabric fibers, or other forensic evidence had been found on her person or clothing in any of the incidents. In over 3 months of extensive surveillance on the Finleys, no one had ever been seen approaching the home, nor did the security cameras police had installed in the Finleys' yard ever pick up movement. The Finleys had also never been approached personally during the plainclothes details following them around town. But the most telling detail to Lemunyon was Ruth's near-fatal stabbing. The fact that she'd been able to drive herself from the store parking lot to her home with wounds that were as deep as they were didn't add up. By all accounts, after an attack like what she had described, Ruth should have bled out in the parking lot. Likewise, police had found out through interviews that Ruth had actually stopped at a gas station on her way home that day, and no one had seen a woman who'd been stabbed or was bleeding or in distress. How could she have been stabbed in the parking lot of a store and no one had noticed such terrible wounds at the gas station? To Lemunyon, there was really only one explanation. Ruth had stabbed herself in the driveway of her own home. This also led the chief to notice that there was only one person who'd been present for every terrible thing that had happened to the Finleys, Ruth, which meant there was a high probability that the poet was Ruth herself. Chapter 8. Proving a Theory. To test his theory, LeMunyon set up a secret surveillance detail on the Finleys to see if they could catch Ruth leaving anything on her doorstep or mailing letters to herself. Their surveillance plan didn't take long, as only a few days into the secret investigation, police found Ruth putting a stack of letters in a mailbox near the local mall. Police intercepted the letters shortly after Ruth left the area, and among a few legitimate pieces of mail, they found 2 envelopes with the poet's signature handwriting, one addressed to Ruth Finley and the other for a local radio station. In addition to this evidence, police also searched Ruth's office at the telephone company and not only found several discarded poems in the poet's rhyme scheme and handwriting in her desk, but the stamps on the letters Ruth had just sent out, both the legitimate mail and the poet mail, were identical to the ones found in her office. Chief LeMunyon was correct. For the past 3 years, Ruth Finley had been terrorizing herself. With the identity of the poet confirmed, LeMunyon now had to find the crucial answer as to why the Finleys had set up such an elaborate hoax on themselves. Or had Ruth herself done all this without Ed's knowledge? LeMunyon asked himself, who would willingly subject themselves to such an ordeal? Was it for attention? LeMunyon didn't think so, as the Finleys' case had gotten very little media or press. And it seemed like Ruth had been consistently uncomfortable being at the center of the investigation. It certainly wasn't for money, as there was no way for the Finleys to have made anything off a hoax that only involved themselves. To get to the bottom of it, LeMunyon decided to start with Ed, as there had been no evidence during the secret surveillance that he'd had any part in the letter mailings. On October 1st, 1981, LeMunyon asked Ed to come to the station to take a polygraph test, to which he wholeheartedly agreed and passed with flying colors. Ed had no idea that his own wife was the source of all their troubles. Ruth had done all of the hoax alone, and LeMunyon confronted her at the police station the next day. But when he told her that she was the poet and he knew it, she acted confused and scared, and LeMunyon could tell that she really didn't believe him. It made him wonder, could part of her have done this without the other part of her knowing she was responsible? LeMunyon took her through the evidence one piece at a time, confronting her with video footage of her mailing the letters, and the discarded poems they'd found in her desk at work. She admitted that she had some memory of writing letters, but not these poems, and not the terrible things mentioned in the poems. LeMunyon then asked why she'd faked her abductions and stabbed herself on the way home from the mall back in August 1979. Again, Ruth admitted that she had some memory of stabbing herself, but she wasn't sure if she'd actually done it or not. The questioning went on in this manner for a few hours, and by the end of the interview, Ruth was in tears, verbalizing that she was sorry and afraid of making LeMunyon angry with her answers. But she really couldn't tell him what was real and what wasn't. It was becoming clear to LeMunyon that Ruth wasn't faking. She really couldn't differentiate in her own memory about what she'd done or not, and he took pity on her. He asked if she wanted to speak to a doctor, to which she agreed, and she was transferred to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. Chapter 9. Ruth's Dark Past. After several weeks of therapy, psychiatrists determined that while Ruth was indeed the poet, she hadn't created the hoax out of any malicious or criminal intent. In fact, Ruth had been suppressing a horrific sexual assault. At only 3 years old, Ruth had been raped by a neighbor, and the abuse had continued well into her elementary school years. In the assaults, the neighbor repeatedly covered Ruth's mouth with a red bandana so she couldn't scream, a motif and symbol that came up frequently in the poet's letters, as well as the gift of the butcher knife that had been sent to Ruth's office. Her assault and burning at the hands of an unknown assailant when she was 16 was also real, and another horrific incident she had to suppress. Her lead psychiatrist, Dr. Pickens, surmised that when Ed fell sick and went to the hospital, her childhood traumas became triggered because she was alone by herself, and the local news had been talking nonstop about the BTK serial killer. The stress of the situation, and her perhaps subconscious fear at becoming a victim again, led Ruth to create The Poet. In an interview he gave, Dr. Pickens explained, "Let me say, she really wasn't terrorizing herself. She was trying to get help for her and protect herself from the terror she experienced as a little girl." For 3 long years, Ruth lived in a debilitating state of psychosis without words to put to her traumatic past. It unfortunately took a police investigation and $370,000 in government resources, which is the equivalent of over $1 million today, to uncover the truth about the poet's reign of terror. And while Ed and their grown children stood behind Ruth and helped her stay in therapy for the next 7 years to fully let go of her childhood traumas, the public was divided on the fact that Ruth was never criminally prosecuted. Chapter 10. A strange story, but a true one. No criminal charges were ever brought against Ruth Finley for several reasons. The first being that after her diagnosis, the DA could find no criminal or malicious intent in what Ruth had done. Secondly, except for Ruth stabbing herself, no one else was hurt during the poet's reign of terror, and the only person who'd suffered any psychological damages was Ruth herself. At most, the only thing Ruth was really guilty of was enforcing the police department to spend lots of money and use valuable resources to solve her case. And while today, that may have been enough to find something to prosecute her on, in 1981, the DA saw her as a mentally ill woman who needed psychiatric care more than a long trial and jail time. By all accounts, Ruth's 7 years in therapy did seem to heal her, as she went on several local news stations to tell her story and assist other sexual assault survivors in coming forward to deal with their trauma. Likewise, the poet never resurfaced, and Ruth Finley led a quiet, simple, and law-abiding life until her death in 2019 at the age of 89. Chapter 11. Audience Invitation. For any of our listeners who want to know more about Ruth Finley, we invite you to check out the 2024 fictionalized film about her life called The Killer Inside, which is available on Lifetime Network. You can also check out the Ruth Finley episode hosted by our friends over at the Women in Crime podcast. And for any of our listeners who are sexual assault survivors or know someone who has suffered a sexual assault, help is available. You can call the Sexual Assault Hotline 24/7 at 800-656-4673 or go to their website, rain.org. That's RAINN.org. Is there a case or an unexplained communication you'd like us to cover? Please take the time to rate and review this show, and in your comments, tell us what case you'd like us to tackle. You can also follow us and reach us on social media. We're on x.com at KillerCPod and on Facebook at facebook.com/KillerCommunicationsPodcast. And be sure to check out our website, KillerCommunicationspodcast.com. Killer Communications listeners, if you want to support this show and get access to things like ad-free listening, early release episodes, and any bonus content, consider supporting us with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. For $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, your AbJack Insider subscription will not only unlock all of these great benefits for this show, but for every podcast on the AbJack network of indie podcasts. Get your AbJack Insider subscription started with a free trial. Simply head over to Apple Podcasts and search for AbJack Entertainment, and you'll find the option to set up and unlock your subscription and start enjoying all the benefits of being a subscriber. We'll also include a link in the show notes. Your support is greatly appreciated. Just a heads up, new episodes of Killer Communications air every other Saturday. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Killer Communications.
Killer Communications is narrated and produced by Mike Morford for AbJack Entertainment. It's researched and written by Abagail Belcastro. Be sure to visit the show's website, KillerCommunicationspodcast.com, for past episodes, social media links, show news, and more.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.